Hello all, and welcome to the Doing Business During Global Upheaval webcast. We will begin in just a few short moments, but before we do, I'd like to remind all attendees that they are currently in listen-only mode, but please feel free to ask questions of our expert panelists at any time, and we will answer them during our live Q&A session at the end. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Mark Moses.
Thank you for joining CEO Coaching International today for our perspective on how to navigate, protect, and grow your business during this global conflict and war between Russia and Ukraine. And as the conflict continues, sanctions by the West are increasing every day. The ruble has tumbled 40%. Commodity prices have gone through the roof, and Russians' money supply has been cut off. Russia is the 12th largest economy in the world, and businesses that rely on Russia or Russian consumers or Russian commodities will have to find new customers and new sources of supply. President Biden announced this week that the US would ban imports of Russian oil, natural gas, and other energy sources in order to inflict more economic damage on the Russian economy for its unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. We will not be part of subsidizing Putin's war, Biden said. Now, Russia is the third biggest oil producer in the world, behind the US and Saudi Arabia, and its energy exports are one of the few economic lifelines it has left following a tidal wave of other sanctions. And this move represents a turning point in the financial war against Russia for a couple of reasons. It will have a direct impact on you, Americans. Less oil supply means higher prices, and higher prices, oil prices means higher gas prices, and higher gas prices are certainly upon us, as you probably have already recognized. Average gas prices hit a record high of $4.32 per gallon yesterday because of the spiking cost of oil. And that's a 62% increase from the beginning of the war on February 24th. Also, the West is united, and while Western countries have been more in harmony in applying other sanctions against Russia, Europe did not join the US in immediately banning Russian energy exports. However, the UK claims they will fully wind down Russian oil imports by the end of this year, and the EU said it will shrink its Russian gas imports by 2/3 over the same time frame. Now, Biden said that the European reluctance to institute a full and an immediate ban is understandable given the continent's dependence on Russian oil. We can take this step when others cannot, Biden said, referring to the fact that Russia only accounted for 3% of the US's crude oil imports in 2020. As compared to the EU at 25%. So what now? While the shock to the US's oil supply won't be catastrophic, the Biden administration still looks to plug this gap. Expect oil producers to ramp up production, and in another quite controversial plan, maybe in the works, to possibly bring in oil from two heavily sanctioned nations, Venezuela, possibly, and Iran. A US delegation actually traveled to Venezuela last weekend to chat, and a new Iran nuclear deal could be agreed to shortly, giving a boost to Iran's oil exports. Now let's zoom out for a moment. Europe's inability to ban Russian oil and gas has been a come to Jesus moment that it needs to wean itself off its Russian energy addiction. On Wednesday, the EU drew up a goal to completely stop buying Russian fuels by 2030. And in big news, 3 of the most iconic American brands just pulled their yellow arches, frappuccinos, and soda drinking polar bears out of Russia. Starbucks and Coca-Cola said this week they would temporarily end all business in the country, and McDonald's, which had come to symbolize Russia's opening to the West post-Soviet Union is McLeaving as well. All three brands condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, McDonald's will take a huge financial hit. 9% of McDonald's global revenue comes from Russia. However, it agreed to continue to pay salaries of its 62,000 workers at the 850 shuttered locations. Russia's not that important for Coca-Cola. In fact, the country is one of the few areas where Pepsi is more dominant, according to CNBC. So what's up with Pepsi? It said it'll stop selling its beverages in Russia and halt all capital investment, advertising, and promotional activities, but will continue selling essentials like milk. Under pressure from consumers and investors, hundreds of other companies have stopped doing business in Russia across all sectors, which will further hurt the struggling nation. Yesterday, Goldman Sachs became the first American bank to say that it would exit the country, followed by JP Morgan Chase. The Japanese clothing company that operates Uniqlo has said it will suspend operations, as has the construction equipment maker Caterpillar. Burger King will end corporate support locations in Russia, and the maker of Jeep, Fiat, and Peugeot vehicles have also suspended imports and exports. Philip Morris suspended planned investments and will reduce manufacturing in Russia. Unilever, which owns brands like Dove and Sunsilk, suspended imports and exports. So did IKEA. TJX, the owner of TJ Maxx and Marshalls, promised to divest its equity ownership in Familia, an office-priced realtor with more than 400 stores in Russia. H&M, which had about 170 stores in Russia, paused sales, as did Nike with 116 stores. Canada Goose, based in Toronto, will cease wholesale and e-commerce sales to Russia. Adidas said it would suspend sales in Russia, cutting 1% from its expected revenue growth this year. The company has about 500 stores in Russia and the former Soviet states. As it relates to energy, Shell will exit ventures with Gazprom, the Russian natural gas giant, and BP will sell its nearly 20% stake in Rosneft, the Russian state-controlled oil company. ExxonMobil will end its involvement in a large oil and natural gas project. Now let's move to finance. In addition to Goldman Sachs, Western Union will suspend its operations in Russia and Belarus. Bain said it would not work with any Russian business and put a policy place in 2020 to not work with the Russian government at any level. McKinsey and Company said would not take on any new work in Russia, would stop work for state-owned entities, and will no longer serve any government entity in Russia. Boston Consulting Group will not take on any new clients in Russia and has started to wind down work where possible. McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group said they did not have any contracts currently with the central government. American Express, MasterCard, and Visa cards issued by Russian banks will not work in any other countries, and cards issued elsewhere will not work for purchases in Russia. Citigroup, which has about 3,000 employees in Russia, said it would assess its operations in the country. Citi's consumer division in Russia is running limited operations and the business is for sale as part of the broader exit from overseas markets announced last year. The big four accounting firms, Deloitte, Ernst & Young, KPMG, and PwC are pulling out of the country. Now let's move to foods. Food, Restaurant Brands International, which owns Burger King, is ending corporate support for the roughly 800 locations operated by local franchisees in Russia and will not approve any additional investment or expansion. Mars, the makers of M&Ms and Snickers, has suspended new investments in Russia. Little Caesars is suspending all operations at Russian stores, which are owned by franchisees. Carlsberg, the world's third largest brewer, said it halted investments and would stop selling its flagship beer brand in Russia. Heineken said it would stop producing, advertising, and selling beer in Russia. Yum Brands is closing 70 company-owned KFC restaurants and all 50 franchise-owned Pizza Hut restaurants. In media, Netflix suspended all service in the country. Walt Disney Company, Sony, and Warner Brothers have also paused the release of movies. Now in tech, Sony, which makes the PlayStation video game, said it suspended all software and hardware shipments to Russia. Amazon Web Services has stopped accepting new customers for its cloud computing services. Google suspended advertising, including on its search and YouTube products. Microsoft and Apple paused sales. IBM suspended sales. Uber said it was trying to accelerate its divestment from the Russian internet company Yandex, which operates its ride-hailing service. And with travel and logistics, Hyatt and Hilton, the hotel chains, suspended development work in the country, and Hilton closed its corporate office in Moscow. UPS, FedEx, and DHL have suspended shipments and operations within Russia and Belarus. Airbus and Boeing have suspended the supply of parts, maintenance, and technical support service to the Russian airlines. Boeing also said it stopped buying titanium from Russia, a key source of the metal for the aerospace industry. American Airlines, Delta Airlines, United Airlines cut ticket sale partnerships with Russian airlines. All three airlines also stopped flying over Russia. In manufacturing, Stellantis, the maker of Jeep, Fiat, Peugeot vehicles, suspended imports and exports. And as I mentioned earlier, Caterpillar, which makes construction and earth-moving equipment, is pausing manufacturing in Russia. Hitachi, the Japanese industrial giant, said it was suspending exports to Russia and pausing manufacturing. Now, if that's not enough, Ukraine and Russia are known for commodities, and the prices of commodities have already gone up dramatically. European natural gas prices skyrocketed to 345 euros per megawatt hour. Prices had never been higher than 30 euros before last year, or 200 before last Friday. And food, wheat prices have ballooned more than 50% since the war began to record highs, which is apparently what happens when nearly 1/3 of the world's total wheat exports, for which Ukraine and Russia are responsible, are knocked offline. They're also a big supplier of cheese. Pricey wheat will disproportionately affect lower income nations such as Egypt, Indonesia, that depend on Ukraine and Russian grains. But soaring food prices don't just make dinner more expensive, they also destabilize society. Protests erupted around the world last time wheat prices were nearly this high in 2008. Wheat futures have surged by more than 40% over the last 5 days, on track for the biggest weekly rise since 1959, as Russia's invasion of Ukraine crimps exports of the crucial food grain and stokes global inflation fears. Now, as it relates to metals, nickel's price jumped 76% earlier this week, which was one of the most extreme moves in metal markets history. Russia is a leading producer of nickel, which is a key ingredient for electric vehicle batteries, and is also used to make stainless steel. Adding to price pressures is that nickel was already in short supply. So the bottom line is this: another massive supply shock is thwacking the global economy just as it was beginning to recover from the COVID everything shortage. However, because the supply crunch isn't accompanied by a boom in economic growth, it increases the risk of stagflation and ultimately recessions around the world. During today's webcast, please send us the questions that are on your mind as it relates to your business, and we will do our best to answer them. You could do this in the chat box on your screen. And at this time, I'd like to introduce to you my partner at CEO Coaching International, Chris Larkins. In addition to being a great coach and a member of our senior leadership team, Chris is a PhD in political science and international studies. He will lead us through some of the suggestions and considerations you lead to lead your business during this unprecedented time. Chris will review critical sets of questions and initial actions you should take in 7 key areas of your business to only protect yourself, but find a way to thrive in the current environment. He will also review other conditions of uncertainty. And while we approach uncertainty again, just like at the beginning of COVID, many of these same steps allowed most of our clients to thrive during the pandemic. Any or all these considerations apply. If you don't know the answer or how to approach them, we're here to help you. And with this, Chris Larkins.
Thank you, Mark. Wow, we just got a very long, comprehensive list of things to think about. And obviously, there are even more things to think about in the news and in the headlines. And there is obviously still a lot about this present crisis that we don't know, namely how it will play out. But there is, in fact, quite a long list of things that we do know. One is, as Mark demonstrated, somehow this crisis, like really any global crisis, is going to affect all of us, either directly or indirectly. We also know that in every crisis, there is an opportunity, somehow. And we know that there are certain steps that can be taken by every business, either to do better and to grow through any global crisis, or to run their business more effectively and ride the storm out in a way that puts them at a competitive advantage at the other end. And here at CEO Coaching International, we have a saying that we learned or relearned during COVID, that your problems may change, but the process does not. And coincidentally, we are exactly 2 years from the day that California shut down its economy due to COVID. And during that crisis, we learned the wisdom of that saying. And in fact, we learned the best practices in 7 categories of your business that you should be following to shore yourself up along the lines of the best defense is a good offense, to grow even in a situation of extreme uncertainty and turbulence, and come out the other side much stronger. So these are very similar to the COVID steps, and I'm going to walk us through fairly quickly, but leaving lots of time for Q&A and discussion, the critical questions and or exercises you should be asking yourselves in these 7 areas: cash, pricing, supply chain, cyber risk, sales, strategy, and operating costs. These questions, as you see, are straightforward and simple, but as they say, simple, not easy. And as Mark said, if you have any questions about these steps, please do feel free to add your question to the chat box. And we're also here to help you should you need any additional attention. So on to the first slide in terms of cash. This is an excellent opportunity for you to revisit how you are. We know that cash is the lifeblood of every business. What is your ability to ride out any storm, to survive any scenario? We're in a scenario right now that might be affecting you right away. It may not affect you for months. But as we learned during COVID, take this as the opportunity either way to ask, have my conditions changed in a way that might affect my cash? And what can I do to secure my cash position and maybe even put myself into a position where I can play offense against my competitors? We learned that the best practice during COVID, and a best practice that you should be doing regularly in your business, is to map out multiple scenarios and see what steps you need to take to build a bridge from where you are now or where you might be under certain scenarios to where you would like to be and to that position that will allow you to go on offense. This here is a very simple sensitivity analysis that your CFO could help you with, we could help you with, or any number of accounting firms could help you with. But this posits a business that typically survives and thrives with about 4 months of cash on hand, as you can see down in the bottom left. And in this case of the cash bridge analysis, it mapped out a scenario. This is a relatively extreme scenario, but possibly likely for many of you, whereby due to the effects of this war, their sales perhaps, what happens if our sales go down by 75%? Or what happens if the sales in our European division go down by 75%, perhaps? what happens to our cash when our sales go down and perhaps our European customers stop paying their bills on time or take even longer to pay their bills. And under this scenario, that relatively comfortable 4 months of cash that the business started with in March dwindles to a week of cash by June. Yes, it can happen that quickly. I recommend that you map out a likely worst case scenario, and identify your likeliest worst case scenarios that could dwindle your cash stockpile. On the next slide, you can use the same exercise to input changes that you would make to your business. You can see at the top, this still assumes the same 75% slide, and it still assumes there in the middle in the receipts row that your customers aren't paying you at the same rate as you had initially anticipated. But it indicates these are some changes highlighted in yellow that we might be able to make to payroll and to operating expenses. We're going to talk about that in a future slide. Some ways that we can manage our payables a little bit better. If we're being paid late, maybe we ought to consider doing the same thing further down the line to the extent we can accept it, and to the extent it's acceptable. And that line of credit that we have sitting off to the side, let's be proactive and tap it now so that we have the cash on hand and don't have to worry about changes in liquidity or increases in borrowing costs like Mark talked about. And under this scenario, this hypothetical business was able to maintain its cash pile and actually build it. And as it's headed into uncertainty, build itself up to a 6-month hoard of cash on hand. And whether the worst happens or not, it now just improved its cash position, and it put itself in a position where it could perhaps make bets on bringing in more inventory to give itself a competitive advantage. Or even to go out and snatch up the best employees in the industry that perhaps are idle or being let go by other companies that reacted too late. Once a cash bridge like this is, Mark, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I think it's a good place for people to think about something like rising energy costs as an example. How does that impact this analysis, right? So imagine you own these large warehouses in the wintertime and you got to heat them. Or imagine you rely on trucking or 3PL services, and you know those costs are going to go. Can you pass those along to your customers or not? Or are you eating them? And these are examples of items that people ought to put in to this cash. I love the cash bridge because different scenarios will enable them to make different decisions to run that cash out. They may not be able to, and I know this is going to come up, to increase prices fast enough but their costs have already gone up. So I like this scenario to really think through and manage their cash, because that ultimately is how one survives a crisis, is having enough cash.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The actual levers that you might have to adjust here to build your likeliest worst case scenario might vary. And it could be under this materials and inventory line. It could just be the cost of trucking or ocean shipping of your inventory has increased, and therefore your cost of goods has gone through the roof. It could be other fixed expenses. And each business should be using its own variables and its own conditions to adjust this. And you can do it in an Excel spreadsheet. You can do it in dynamic fashion. What happens if our materials cost doubles because of inflation? What does that do to our cash? And you can build a plan and select among different scenarios that you can execute on immediately. And I would urge every business, once you settle on a scenario you like, don't wait for the headlines to tell you it's time to flip the switch. If something will double your cash pile, do it, right? And don't delay. You can always pull something back. You can't unspend cash that you shouldn't have spent if you didn't take the measures that you could have to avoid a cash crunch. The next slide, once you've chosen a scenario that you like, we recommend as a best practice that every CEO have a cash dashboard that they see regularly. And this might be daily based on the pace of business at your company. It might be several times a week. But this is an opportunity to track in real time, how are we doing compared to the targets that I set in the scenario that I built? Is our cash on hand increasing? Are our bookings increasing? Or are our sales going down even further than I anticipated? And this is a way that you can stay on top of this instead of being surprised one day by a CFO that tells you, my forecast says we'll run out of cash in 30 days. Don't put yourself in a position to be surprised. And if this dashboard suggests you're doing even better than your scenario, it gives you that advanced or leading indicator that you could perhaps begin to go on offense. Bring in a little bit more inventory, go for that competitive advantage, make a key hire. Let's go ahead to the next category, and happy to answer any questions on this. This factors right in, and Mark just mentioned, factors right into the cash bridge. And in fact, all of these sets of questions will somehow impact your cash bridge assumptions. But this is the best time to question pricing. And I know this might be a little bit counterintuitive. We looked at pricing during COVID. We looked at pricing during the supply chain crunch. And now we're in an inflation, the strongest inflationary period, at least in the United States, that we've had in recent memory. But I would say, in my observation and our observation at CEO Coaching International across 450 clients, the clients during COVID and the supply chain crunch that were proactive on pricing and took calibrated risks to embrace higher pricing, by far did consistently better. And they put themselves in a position whereby they had the cash on hand to take even bigger bets once the supply chain crisis came around. They had the cash on hand by way of embracing higher prices to bring in more inventory and to pay more for it. Whereas their competitors often had warehouses that were running dry because they didn't build those cash piles. Let's go to the next slide. There are just some key questions that you should ask yourself. As you talk about price increases among your executive team, and you're likely to find some resistance, perhaps from the sales team, ask yourself how many price increases you've absorbed from your own vendors. And we all know that price increases are uncomfortable to pass along. But go ask your purchasing department, how many of our own vendors have increased prices, and how many of them have we fired? The answer is probably a lot and none. And so if that helps you build the courage and conviction that this is time, even if you've already raised prices 4 or 5 times, to go back to the well and take a look at your pricing again, I think it's important to look at it from that perspective. Ask yourself, when's the last time you did a real competitive survey? If you're asking your salespeople, who are often motivated to take the path of least resistance, what are your competitors doing? And you're relying only on that message, you may not have the full picture. Rely on your key relationships, call the people you know that you own in the industry, and find out what your competitors are doing in terms of pricing. Ask yourself if your cost plus model is still serving you. If you're still figuring out pricing by taking cost of goods and dividing by 0.7 to get a 30% margin, ask yourself if that's a bit outdated. I personally am in favor of just plain simple economics, supply and demand. What will the market bear? And in this situation of scarcity, it's fair to ask yourself, without being greedy and without feeling guilty, where else would our customers go? If it's a supply chain crisis and you've got the product and you can look at yourself in the mirror by charging higher prices, why wouldn't you? And finally, I would look for what competitive advantage you can get on value pricing. And if it's not pricing, if you find you can't budge much on pricing or as much as you'd like to, take a look at that last bullet. You may not be able to increase your prices up, but can you win on terms and conditions? Can you exchange, instead of a 10% price increase, a 5% increase for some agreement for by your client to prepay or put a deposit or change a net 45 to a net 30? Look for different ways to be flexible here to change the assumptions in your cash bridge. Let's go to the next category. Supply chain. This is you'll notice that a lot of the thinking here is an opportunity for us to be disruptive. And every crisis I view as an opportunity to be disruptive and to change up the way we're doing things. If you go to the next slide, there are several questions we should be asking ourselves about our sourcing. And there are scenarios that we should be playing out, not only to survive any supply chain crunch that might continue, but also to put ourselves at an ongoing competitive advantage. We should be, as CEOs, identifying every way our supply chain depends even indirectly on Europe. Mark went through several ways that we may be affected even indirectly by Europe. And we remember the old adage that a butterfly flaps its wings in China and it rains in Chicago. This is an example of that chaos theory, that the price of grain might affect a container ship to go one way and not be available to you. Figure out how you're dependent on Europe, even indirectly, and shore that up. The second question being extremely provocative. We've heard a lot of questions lately about, wouldn't it be nice if more companies made product in America or closer to home? And it's often met with, yeah, but we just can't disentangle from Asia. Well, what if you could? I'm someone personally that has made a lot of hay out of challenging notions that were considered impossible or unlikely. And I encourage you to challenge that same point of view into this question. What would your supply chain look like if we're only half as dependent on Asia or half as dependent on Europe? If your product costs a little bit more to make in the United States or Mexico or Latin America, is that somehow offset by the fact that your container won't be sitting for 8 weeks off the port of Long Beach and you'll actually have product in stock? Is it actually cheaper now that an ocean container might cost $30,000, $40,000? Is it now cheaper to make something in Mexico or Costa Rica or South America and pay the trucking? If your competitors aren't looking at this question, you should. And most competitors are listening to, oh, we're just too entangled in Asia. We can't answer this question. Disrupt yourself. Move to the next question. This is an area where you really should be playing a little bit more defense than offense. We have heard rumors or suggestions of cyber war being deployed in this current crisis. But cyber risk predates this crisis, and we probably all know companies that have been hacked directly or through ransomware. The risk of this is, in fact, much more acute in this environment. And we have already heard of Chevron and other infrastructure companies being targeted. We shouldn't rest on our laurels and assume, well, we're not Chevron, we're okay. If you go to the next slide, the one fact that we need to accept is that we all have data that is valuable to a hacker, directly or indirectly. And it could be as simple as a list of our clients and the CEOs and the CFOs at our clients. And you should be asking yourselves, you should be sitting with your CTO and your team, do I have redundancy? If I get hit with a ransomware attack, do I have any options other than to pay $1 million in Bitcoin? Or is there some way I can continue my business? How would I continue my business, in fact? How would I not just avoid that attack, but how would I continue my business without my systems and data for a week? Guess what? It's possible. We all used to do it. It wouldn't be efficient and it wouldn't be fun. But that is part of the emergency preparedness plan that every business should have. And if you haven't answered that question, you should be answering it now. An overlooked part of insurance coverage, you should be talking to your CFO about and your insurance broker is cyber insurance coverage. It is very affordable. You don't have to pay it in Bitcoin, and it will protect you in case the worst happens. And then finally, reach out to your subject matter experts in this case. And we know several of them if you'd like introductions. You should be securing your data. You should be securing your systems themselves. And you should have some sort of an identity management program so that your email addresses and your cell phone numbers and such can't be spoofed and used for phishing attacks. And finally, hire a firm that can do a regular audit of your cybersecurity. And if you remember the movie Catch Me If You Can, a lot of these firms will actually break into your system and reveal all of your weaknesses, including those that you didn't know existed. This is the time for someone under your guidance to break into your system and figure out where you're vulnerable. Next set of slides. Let's go back on offense. You heard me say previously that every challenge presents an opportunity. Every crisis presents an opportunity. And this is the opportunity for us to take stock on, in the new environment, are my assumptions for where my sales were going to come from going to hold up? Are they being challenged by the current environment? Are they being challenged even by my competitors' reaction or lack of reaction to the current environment? So the first step here, we can go to the next slide. We have a tool here at CEO Coaching International called the Roadmap, Plan, and Playbook. And the roadmap is what every CEO should be leaving this call looking at. The roadmap contains all of your assumptions about how you'll grow. Not just the amount, and not just we're going to grow by 20%, go forth and prosper, but literally we're going to grow by 20%, and this much is going to come from new customers, and this much is going to come from existing customers, and this much is going to come from reducing churn. Ask yourselves under these conditions, have any of those assumptions changed? And it's not a quick conversation. It should be a very challenging conversation. Is this an opportunity to get more customers because our competitors are faltering, or they're even more connected to the mess in Europe today, and we have opportunity to scoop up their customers? It's also an opportunity to change the assumptions. We talked about pricing and inflation. If that new customer amount, if an average customer used to be worth 100,000, and now because of inflation and price increases is worth 125,000, revisit it here. And use this, if we go to the next slide, collect these new assumptions, challenge yourselves, get together with your team. Don't take for an answer that nothing's changed because we know the headlines tell us it's not true. Use that to collect the assumptions and then follow the steps down to the plan and playbook. Based on those new assumptions, what are the specifics for how we're going to achieve growth? That's your plan. And playbook, based on those specifics, how are we going to approach the market? That's your playbook. I recommend that in spite of having, if you have done your sales strategy in December, follow this set of exercises, redo it now at the top of the quarter, and go into the remainder of the year asking yourselves how those assumptions have changed and what you should do about it. Next set of slides. I talked a lot about disruption. This is now the invitation to disrupt yourself. And if we can go to the next slide, I'm going to encourage every CEO to ask themselves and to gather their executive teams and ask their executive teams one simple set of questions. If under the current conditions, or these conditions after inflation and supply chain and COVID, we were starting this business today from scratch, what are we doing now that we would stop doing in our new company? What are we not doing now that we would start doing in this new company? And how would I take this new company I'm creating to put myself out of business? This is the time to ask these questions. And they're very provocative and they're very disruptive. But I suspect that by asking these questions, you and your team are going to come up with a set of answers and be forced to ask yourselves, well, why aren't we doing these already? And why aren't we doing these now? And use this crisis as an opportunity to challenge preconceived notions, because the winners are the ones that challenge those notions first. Let's move on to the next set of questions, and we're going to wrap up here very shortly. I mentioned operating costs to secure your net margin. If we can go to the next slide, this will feed right into your cash bridge. But it's not just the easy levers of we're going to reduce payroll, say, by 5% across the board, or whatever defensive moves you might need. This is another opportunity for disruption. No one likes to lay off employees, particularly productive ones. So ask yourselves, who are the B and C players who I am still subsidizing? I subsidized them through COVID. I subsidized them through supply chain. Everyone's telling me, and I've experienced personally, that hiring is really, really tough right now. And yet I'm still subsidizing B and C players on my team. This is an excellent time, if you want to get defensive, to use this in a way that allows you to upgrade your B and C players so that when you come out the other side, you're ready to hit the ground running. That inefficiency you've been living with, for whatever reason, this is a time to challenge it and question it and reduce your operating costs accordingly. And I'm going to encourage every CEO on this call to ask those two questions, and then the third and the fourth on this slide. Based on those questions, make yourselves some commitments in Q2 to change something about the B and C players or about the inefficiencies that you're tolerating. And find a way to hold yourself accountable to making those choices, because these will be tough choices. And then what I believe is our final set of questions. Next slide. Nope, that was it. I apologize. This is an excellent time. I went through that material very fast. I went through it fast by intention so that we'd have time for Q&A and discussion. And remember that we are here not only during this period, but also to help you offline. If you have any questions whatsoever about any of the tools or exercises that I walked you through. I'm now going to bring our panel on board. You've all met Mark Moses. He's our founding partner and CEO of CEO Coaching International. You've met me and you have heard my introduction. And we are pleased to be joined by Rafael Paniagua, who is also a partner at CEO Coaching International, who is the CEO of ABB Brazil, and who is based in Córdoba, Spain, and is our representative here on the panel with a particularly experienced perspective, not just on the global energy markets and global industrial markets, but the view on the ground from Europe. And with that, I invite you to populate your questions in the chat box, and Mark will lead us through that Q&A.
Great, thank you, Chris. That was an excellent presentation, and I appreciate the 7 critical steps that are items for everyone to think about. As it relates to 7.9% inflation, how is that going to affect my construction business? So, any thoughts on answer to that question?
I can offer a few, and some of that will depend if you're talking about projects under contract, or if you're talking about the new business that you're currently bidding on. Projects that are under contract, I recommend that you go into your CFO, that you perhaps consult your attorney and scrutinize that contract. Many of those contracts will have clauses to deal with price increases and inflation. So that's a first step, and that also applies, by the way, to anyone that works on contract business. A lot of government suppliers, for example, will be on contracts that do allow for price increases, and you should see if your contract does as well. Going forward, this is where relying on your key relationships, understand what your competitors are doing in the market, and going into your upcoming pricing with very strong clarity about how far you can push the envelope. I can guarantee you can, but you need to have those conversations. It's one of your top jobs as a CEO, is to rely on those relationships that you own to understand where you can take your pricing, how far upward you can go with while not losing your bids.
Thank you, Chris. What industries do you guys at CEO Coaching believe will be the most impacted by the war?
Rafael, would you like to give a perspective from Europe?
Yeah, I think that's definitely good morning to everyone. Definitely the industries that will be, they have much more relationship with Europe, especially with the Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. Some of them are very much related to the agriculture business, where the Eastern Europe, especially Ukraine, has been very strong, and Russia. Anything related to energy, so clearly energy business are the one very much affected. And we have been listening from Mark reactions from many countries in Europe and the UK of blocking of having the oil and gas, some other energies from Russia, but that will take a long time because that will be very difficult for some of the Central European countries. And then definitely the third one, anything related to logistic, anything that they are around logistic that will require a lot of borders crossing, the fuel, the energies, and then a lot of interactions in between countries that will be affected. Definitely, yes.
Thank you, Rafael. And what, as it relates to supply chain, we all dealt with that during COVID in a variety of different industries. What industries or what part of the supply chain will be most impacted by the war?
From my point of view, and the perspective of many of our clients, we're starting to look at raw materials, right? So not so much the shipping disruptions themselves, although those need to be considered, but right down to steel, like not even some of the fancier and less known commodities that go into batteries and electric vehicles and such, but steel is Eastern Europe is a major supplier of steel wire, steel bar, steel plate. And during the initial supply chain crisis, we were having, there were inflationary pressures on here just because of the cost of shipping, right? So it was a stabilized commodity pricing, but a more expensive ocean container bringing your supplies into the United States or elsewhere. And now we really need to be very mindful of anything that has steel in it and what's going to happen to that pricing. Our clients have already raised prices because of the cost of shipping. They will have to contemplate and take action on another round of price increases on top of the shipping costs because they will not stabilize anytime soon. But now, what are these commodity prices doing, or what are they likely to do to the raw materials or finished products that I bring in from Europe?
Rafael?
Yeah, I think on top of building on top of what Chris said, I think that's put it on that on perspective of the energy prices, specifically in Europe, and that's a kind of second tier or second consequence for the commodities and many other products that they are energy intensive. So that's very important that all of our businesses and clients that they are dependent of energy intensive product of commodities like copper, chemical products, or any others, aluminiums or others that have been processed in Europe. There will be not only a huge price increase of inflation, but there are many industrial companies in Europe that they are stopping, that they are blocking, and they are discontinuing their business at this point of time due to the price of the energies. We need to understand that the energy prices have multiplied by 5 and 10 times in most of the countries in Europe. So that make it completely uncompetitive and unaffordable to produce certain high intensive materials with energy.
And Mark,
Thank you, Rafael. Chris?
Yeah, on top of this, I think it would be fair for US-based businesses or North American-based businesses broadly to consider what some of these pressures will do to demand, right? Like, so the supply chain obviously is going to be disrupted, but when gas starts getting to $5, $6 a gallon, what impact does that have on disposable income? And what impact might that have on consumers' behavior? And for example, if you supply product into multiple industries, and one of them is, say, furniture, and perhaps you supply textiles or even wood or nails or whatever it might be, it would be fair, back to the roadmap plan and playbook on sales, you should question, is consumer behavior with inflation and other factors going to change how much business I'm going to be getting from that revenue channel? And should I not be proactive right now in assuming that perhaps that channel is going to decrease and I need to shift my marketing and sales attention into some other channel that is less affected by consumer behavior?
So let's go back to this issue of inflation. So inflation with food costs going up around the world essentially is making our employees' income going down. So as their inflationary pressures go up, if wages aren't going up accordingly, it's putting pressure. The disposable income of employees is less. How do you urge us to act on that as an employer?
Look, we have to approach that with not just empathy for our employees, but also a dose of realism. We are already in a market where it is extraordinarily difficult to hire an employee. And the idea that we would lose an employee over a modest sum, a bigger cost of living increase than we are accustomed to giving, particularly in the last 20 years, is something that we should avoid. And that goes beyond empathy. If we want to lead with empathy, that's fair, but do what's right for your business. And if you have an A player, this is the time to shore up and protect your ability to keep that person, rather than have them, look, recruiters are very busy right now. They're calling your employees. They're going to get a call and say, how would you like to earn 20% more, 25% more? I have heard offers going to executive assistants that would blow our minds. And we need to be realistic about that. I think that goes back, Mark, to one of the slides talking about operating expense and identifying what are the B and C players you're subsidizing. This is an excellent time to look at who am I subsidizing, who's a C player or a B player, and can I use some of that subsidy to increase the wages and take some pressure off of my A players?
Chris, what I'm hearing you say is it is what it is. Deal with it. Make sure your employees are comfortable so they don't walk down the street, because your hiring costs to replace them will go up meaningfully. So I think that's a good takeaway for people. And if you got to raise prices accordingly or optimize your cost structure, bring your cost structure down to offset that, that's something for consideration. Let me move in a different direction. Eastern Europe has been an excellent hub for American companies that want outsourcing done in Europe. And lost software development's been done in Ukraine for a long period of time. What's going to happen with that? So near term, that's probably going to be very difficult. Where's that likely going to move to? Rafael, you being in Europe, you might have a sense for that.
Yeah, I think one of them is very difficult to predict, but one of the analysts here in Europe has said this conflict will stay for long. So that the first thing is we need to start thinking is we need to start planning for a long term. We're not talking of days, we're not talking of weeks. That can be months or even years. Is that what some of the analysts said? So that's that. Saying that on the other hand, stay for long and look like that is the prediction for most of the analysts, is that will be very concentrated in certain places. So what look like is that even Central European and Eastern Europe countries, even some of them former Soviet unions, will stay healthy. They will stay very strong. They will continue to be their operations steadiness. So not the major issues for that one. So most probably look like, and that is what we have seen already with more than 2 million people moving outside of Ukraine and more coming out, that the European Union is accepting as a real citizen of the European Union citizen in their eastern, mainly Poland and the other countries. So we will see migration, a strong migration of this talent that we used to be outsourcing or working with. Most of this talent will be moving to the neighbor countries. So probably in the medium term, what we will see is stronger neighbor countries around Ukraine.
Great. Well, thank you, Rafael. As we move to wrap up, I'd like any CEO that's out there running their business, if you need somebody to talk to during this crisis and would like to speak with one of our coaches at CEO Coaching International for a free call to assess and talk about what you're dealing with, we would be happy to do that. We did that during COVID to hundreds of CEOs around the world, and we would be happy to offer that again to help you navigate the biggest item on your mind, whether it's how to deal with inflation and pricing or how to deal with potentially skyrocketing operating costs in your business. And maybe we can ask Rafael and then Chris, and then I will close out with, what is the one piece of advice you would give a CEO right now in navigating this conflict, navigating their business during this conflict?
Yeah, I think as I said, let me start. As I said before, I think that's we need to be prepared for changes. We need to be very dynamic. Things are coming very quickly. Problems are different, but our processes and our system need to stay. So we need to be strong on our commitment, on our systems. supporting our teams, and be very well prepared and very well reacting in advance, much faster than the rest of our competitors and the other companies in our sector.
Thank you, Rafael, and thank you for joining us today. Chris, what advice would you give a CEO running their domestic or global company today? It would be the number one thing.
Focus on what you can control. Obviously, the headlines and the images that we're watching on TV on the internet are very weighty. They're very saddening, and it is very easy to be caught up in what does this mean? Where is this going? What's going to happen to my business? Those are all very human emotions. The companies that survive and then thrive are the ones that channel that anxiety and that restlessness into these are the things I can control and that I do control and that I can do about those things. And I went through a list of 7 categories that represent areas where all of our CEOs have some levers of control. And my takeaway for the audience is identify those and throw all of your anxiety into controlling those levers.
Great. Thank you, Chris, and thank you for your comments today. My feedback would be this. When we went through COVID, we were dealing with completely unexpected. In 100 years, there hadn't been a pandemic, and it wasn't. And we had no idea how long it would last. Would it be? Several people thought it might be just a few months, maybe 6 months, but it was extreme to think it would go on 2 years. And in 2020, 87% of our clients grew their business during that time. And some, as you probably remember, Chris and Rafael, their revenue went to zero because their markets were completely decimated during that time. So think about it. I appreciate the comment from Chris. What do you have control over? And we've given you 7 items that we believe are those for you to consider. Pick which 1 or 2 of those items you feel most threatened by during this and figure out a plan for you to tackle that. And this issue, I believe this issue of pricing and inflation is going to be an issue for most businesses, whether you're dealing with it today or you're going to deal with it in the coming months. Inflation is upon us and you will need to deal with it. Secondly, I want to make this comment. A recession is still likely, and it could happen. It's been a long time since 2008. So how do I prepare myself for what could be a recession that may come a year from now or 2 years from now or sooner? So get your arms around that. And with that, I want to thank Rafael Paniagua joining us from Spain, Chris Larkins joining us today from Southern California, and me, a pleasure to be with you from the Bahamas. Wishing you all the best in navigating this conflict, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.